insurance together, the requirements, the cost based on, and how sponsors of the drugs or devices have to put programs together for insurance. They have so much funding, they have so many requirements they have to meet, and it's a lot of things that need to come together. So feel free to ask any questions. I do have copies of the slides if you want them afterwards, and feel free to ask, for any clarifications. That's our disclaimer we always have to use in the presentation. So basically our objectives today, we're going to talk about the critical roles in the clinical trial insurance process. And we're going to talk about insurance program structure and options, things that I put together along with my customers. The typical information requirements that are requested by sponsors of drugs and devices. And the key underwriting considerations and things I have to look forward to help you put the most flexible and customized tech program together. So the critical roles are various people. So first of all, we have the sponsor. So that's the clinical organization or organization that has the drug or device that needs to be tested in a clinical trial. How are they going to get it from animal studies all the way to an approved product to be used for ongoing patients out in the world? They work usually directly with an insurance broker or agent who acts as an intermediary, so they kind of come to them and they help you put the insurance program together. They have relationships with various insurance companies and underwriters and know who to go to for expertise. In our world of life sciences, there are a handful of companies that focus on this, so not everyone is comfortable with putting these types of insurance programs together because they're so different. The contract research organization, they're the person that works with the IRBs, the investigators, the sponsor sites. They will work directly on your behalf to provide help and conduct the clinical trials for the sponsors. So they have a wide variety of duties and responsibilities. And then you have the underwriter, who helps put the terms and conditions together of the overall insurance program. So typically, the sponsor and the insurance broker have a close relationship. The sponsor and the contractor research organization have a very close relationship. The underwriter and the broker have a very close relationship. And hopefully, most times, as I'm usually lucky and fortunate to do, is the underwriter, through the insurance broker, has a good relationship with the sponsor. So those are kind of how the rules kind of lay out. So, what we like to recommend is that early and close communication between all parties is critical to put together smooth and timely placement. A lot of times people have so many responsibilities, especially in the R&D stage. They have many things with the tax and with the accounting, with the regulatory, with the funding, and they need to bring everything together in order to make sure that they're going to take their technology and get it to the first phase trial, the next phase trial, and ultimately get their product approved. A lot of times people come to your broker or to the underwriter at the 12th hour and say, oh my gosh, I'm starting a trial in France tomorrow. I need insurance coverage to get to the ethics committee, approval by the IRB, so we can get this trial started. We don't want to delay, because delays mean costs, and costs are already high and you're trying to contain them. So we like to remind people that as part of your overall process in putting a clinical trial together, that you look at the insurance requirements, looking forward, having good communication, finding out if there is local placements, and we'll get more into that down the road, but the U.S. requirements are different than Denmark, than France, than Italy, all over the world. And so the more you know and can talk and coordinate, the easier it is when it comes to actually placing the insurance, so you don't have a delay in starting a trial, and that's ultimately what you want to do. So there's lots of insurance programs available out there, and typically what a U.S. company will do is they will need what we call an annually renewable master policy. So that's one global insurance policy for their product's liability, which can provide coverage for clinical trials, and typically they're for the United States and Canada. That's your typical territory definition. Most policies have the ability to add a global extension, so you basically get worldwide coverage. So that's the policy you would start with. It basically outlines the insurance coverage, what you'll cover, who you'll cover. It's for bodily injury in case there's a problem during the trial. That's your first line of defense, if you will. Then you have your country-specific, protocol-specific, and admitted trials. So what this means is if you're going to do, say, 4 trials of the same drug or device, and you're going to start, most likely you don't usually start in the U.S. It's a little bit easier to start trials overseas. The regulations are a little bit more open-minded and a little bit easier to get going, to get the data, than to bring back to the United States. So say you're going to start in Australia, you're going to start in France, and you're going to start in the UK. So you need to know, based on those country specifics, if they're going to require an additional local policy in addition to the annual policy. Which means if you have to buy a second policy, that's going to cost you more money. So that's part of the cost structure. So you put your first master policy in place. If you go to Australia, for example, you need $10 million Australia dollar limit to do a trial in Australia, except in Sydney you need 20 million. So they value life very well there, and they want to make sure that people are carrying the right amount of limits. Now in the UK, they don't require local limited policy. They'll accept the global master, which is great. So they will accept evidence that you've put a policy in place, and they will allow you to pay for any claims that might happen in the UK during a trial. So as you're outlining and mapping where you're going to be doing trials, that's part of the consideration, because each policy you list will have its own limits, which is good to protect your patients, but it'll be more cost. And a master control program, what we call that, is when you basically go to one insurance carrier and they control it for you. So they structure and customize it. So the same company provides the local policies and issues them, say in Australia, as well as issuing the one in the United States. That's something Chubb can do. So kind of you put it together. If you're one person looking at all of your exposures, it's probably a better structured policy, and it's probably a better funded program as far as probably not as expensive, because I'm not going to charge you for this policy and then charge you over here for like double dipping, if you will. So far, okay?
Kayce,
Yes, I'm sorry.
with these master control programs and the overseas testing and whatnot, is there anything they have to comply with or provide as far as additional insurance are concerned, or is it just two separate policies that can be tapped into if necessary?
So that's a good question. So as far as additional insureds, a lot of times in the local policy, you'll name the U.S. sponsor, and many times they'll have a local legal rep in that country, because say in Australia, you don't have a presence there, so you'll hire somebody to be your rep. So that person will also be insured under the policy. If there is some kind of problem with the protocol in Australia, the first line of defense would be that local admitted $10 million Australian policy that you put in place. The global master comes into effect if you've exceeded those limits, if it's a very, very bad situation. And or sometimes there's some terms and conditions in the local policy that are not picked up. For example, clinical trial contractors, somebody doing the testing the product on your behalf, are not always covered under the local policies, but they're typically insured under the master policy. So that policy, so they're put together to dovetail, so there's not gaps in coverage. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right. So we have, like we said before, the annual policy can respond to the clinical trial liability and product liability. So some companies have approved products that they have out in the marketplace that they're already selling, and they're having ongoing trials where they're trying the next compound or next device, the next prototype, or something for a completely different application. For example, in medical devices, the FDA will follow a protocol and approve a device for a certain application. If you find that it works for something else, you're not supposed to use it off-label and just start using it in the other application. You're supposed to go back to the FDA, write a new protocol, and get it approved for that application. Sometimes the process is a little bit shorter depending on how different the application is, but you're supposed to have approval for each. So you can have many times companies can be both commercial and in R&D. And so you want to make sure you have a global policy that picks up both coverages. And many of the products that are out there do cover both products and clinical trials. What you want to look for, though, are some policies only provide clinical trials. If they think you're an R&D and you're providing clinical trials, and then you start commercialization and start manufacturing, you want to make sure that the product's liability is also extended. So once it's out in the marketplace to the masses, you have coverage. As I mentioned before, typical jurisdictions, US and Canada, but globally, putting the endorsement on there to make it worldwide is very common. You want to also make sure that suits can be made, brought worldwide. Sometimes they'll make a worldwide territory, but suits have to be brought in the US. So the broadest option out there is to have a suit brought anywhere in the world. And then finally, covering trials in your home country and other countries when non-admitted non-admitted insurance is permitted. What the non-admitted means is if I am a US company and I have this global master policy and I'm doing business in the UK and they do not require an additional second local policy, that's considered not admitted because doing business in the UK is outside of the United States. But it's accepted because of the requirements there. Does that make sense? Okay, so the local country. So basically, admitted company, admitted policy means written by a company licensed to conduct business in that trial country. So as in Australia, that example, you need to have a local admitted company doing business on the ground in Melbourne or Sydney in Australia to provide the insurance. So even if you're working with a Chubb, the Australia office is the one that actually issues the policy on Chubb of Australia insurance type of coverage. So, and then that meets all the requirements of the RRBs, the ethics committees, and then if you can go ahead and do your trial, you're following the law. The other good thing about that is if unfortunately there's a claim and someone's injured, you have people on the ground that can respond to the claim. The claim is handled in that local country. They can work with the medical system, and it's usually a more streamlined process rather than bringing a claim back to the United States. Policy terms and conditions are written to comply with the laws. A lot of the countries have their own wording, but basically they want to provide bodily injury for a patient that might be injured during the process of the trial. Many times they're written in the local language and in the currency. As I mentioned, it facilitates the local claim payment if you have the local policy in place, and mandatory in some jurisdictions. So a lot of this is kind of repeat here. So the master control program, what this really means is coordinating the annual policy for the United States, Canada, and countries where you don't have to have a local requirement, and the countries where you do have to have a local placement. So coordinating that whole program. So it's possible many times to have a company that's doing trials all over, and you can have 6, 8, 10, 15 policies, depending on how far abroad you're working and in what countries you're working. It's also possible to work in places only like the UK or some of the Eastern European countries where they don't require any local policy. You can just have that one policy and it can respond to several countries. It just depends on where you decide to go. China, of course, and India are very big countries that are really expanding. They're doing a lot of trials because there's a lot of people there, and they're trying to, get that, get the treatment out to the people there. India has some very specific requirements. You can only buy a local admitted from somebody in India. So most companies like me or some of my competitors can't help you in India from an admitted requirement. But there are companies there that would sell directly to the insured on their behalf there. China is a little bit easier to do coverage and to get policies issued, but they're just kind of watching in the laws. In India, they're concerned that they're signing people up as guinea pigs and too many people are being used, and so you have to be careful with incentives and how you entice people, if you will, to come into a trial to make sure that they're really being treated safely and efficaciously. All right, so local admitted placements are directed by the master policy insurer, so whoever usually writes your global master policy would help you with the local policies, with a few exceptions, as I said in India. The difference in conditions and difference in limits provisions, that's what I mentioned, where if you have a local policy that doesn't provide, say, coverage for a clinical trial contractor, then that's a difference in conditions, so the renewable master could drop down and pick up the coverage for that. So they're like I said, used to dovetail together. Or if you, I'm sorry.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned some of the issues like in India with the incentives. I mean, is there a country that you're seeing like particular issues from? Like, if you had your choice from insurance perspective, don't go here.
For a while we had a problem with Belgium because they basically, because of the requirements, you could provide an insurance policy and you're supposed to cover for bodily injury. But if somebody got hurt and had nothing to do with the drug or device, they just got hurt for whatever reason, you had to pay. So it was like a all-risk kind of medical type of policy. Thankfully, we got the law changed in Belgium, so that's not a problem anymore. Those types of things, those are the kind of countries that scare you. quite honestly, there's not a lot of problematic countries right now. In Australia, their limits requirements are so high because they're becoming much more litigious, closer to the United States, and that's unfortunate. We're still in Europe, they're a little bit not quite so litigious in that way. So there's just some countries that are easier to do business in. Some countries.
So you see that trend away from Australia back to Europe?
No, they're still doing it both. I would say that there's no countries people are moving away from. South America is a really growing area, so you've seen more in Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and Peru. New Zealand and Australia are still booming ahead. France and Germany are still two of your biggest countries. The requirements in France and Germany are quite high, with a $5 million aggregate in Germany and a $6 million in France, because they want to make sure that they're taken care of. The other thing in France is if you have a pediatrics trial, they have medical through until they're 18 years old, automatically covered under the policy. That's the requirement. So there's some interesting nuances to them, but I would say that there's none that we're really shying away from right now. But the thing about these countries and regulations is they change on a daily basis. So, people ask us a lot of times, can you give us a little cheat sheet? Well, we'd love to, but the cheat sheet is constantly changing, because today, what one regulation may be, tomorrow it could be completely different. There are some countries, Israel, Turkey, Colombia, and I'm not picking on them, they're just slower to get business out of. So if you need a certificate quick, so you can get it to the ethics committee, so you can get it approved, so you can start your trial, then you need a bigger lead time. Whereas other countries, they're just quicker and they're used to doing it. So from that standpoint, it's not that we don't do it, you need to know that it's going to take longer. Does that answer the question?
It does.
Each country is probably critical to your process. So a lot of times what I suggest is asking a prospective insurer through the agent, so what countries do you think you're going to go to? And I will be happy to tell you at the time, these are what the requirements are. Yes, we're going to have to write several policies, or one we can do on the master policy, or we can do a combination thereof, and give you kind of an idea. The higher the limit, obviously, the more premium it's going to be. There's some countries that just require $100,000 in limit just to make it legal. Those policies are going to be much more affordable. And then maybe you decide that you're going to change up a couple of countries you're going to go into. So it's kind of a preparing, how you're going to go forward type of situation. So these are the things I get to look at all day long. So these are things, so as a customer, you know what your insurance broker is going to ask you, because they're going to have to provide to me. And the more information I know, I can provide to you to put your best program forward. And that's really important. So of course, there's always an application. They're very long, they ask lots of questions, but it's all good information, usually things that are pretty straightforward. We ask for financial information, knowing that most of these companies are just beginning. They have Series A, Series B funding, and so they're being venture backed, which is great. That's what we expect, but that's good money. We do look at prior claims history. We like to look at the protocols. I get to read a lot of protocols, which is a lot of fun, which gives you a lot of data of what the actual device or drug is and what it's going to be doing. Informed consent document is probably one of the most important things, because that is the document that you give to the patient, the prospective patient, that's if they meet the eligibility requirements, they're going to have to read through and say, this is going to help me, this is an alternative treatment, these are the risks that can happen, or this may not help me, and the process. You're going to have to go to the labs, you're going to have follow-up treatment, this process is going to take a year. So we typically ask that that document is almost more important than the protocol, because that kind of skinnies down to about 10 pages versus 100 pages, and it's in 6th grade language typically, so most people can understand what the document says. So later in court, if there's a problem, they say, well, you read this and you understood this kind of thing, to help protect. We look for sites and investigators many times, especially on the local admitted policies. The sites and doctors want to be shown on the certificate so they understand that there's coverage for them if the trial, something goes wrong. And we usually need information in the local language, which is readily available. So we look for, as I mentioned, the readability and the comprehension on the informed consent. That's very important. The sponsors need to work with a clinical research organization and investigators based on selection criteria that's going to be the best match to do the trial and to test their drug or device. The participant compensation, we don't put a flat amount out there, but if they're offering huge amounts of money for somebody to come in the trial, that's kind of a no-no. Obviously, a lot of people will pay for your time and travel, so it's usually nominal, but it pays for your gas or whatever to get to and from the clinic if you have to go for several visits. That's the norm. And compliance with elements of the informed consent. You really, once you write the informed consent, you want to make sure that the doctors that are doing the testing for you, they're following it to a T. So to make sure everything's we do an analysis of the investigational product. If there's any vulnerable populations, pediatrics, like the little baby with the wearable, that's a little bit scarier type of thing than, you know, some other types of devices or drugs that are out there. So we wanted to make sure that if people are cognitively impaired, pediatrics, prisoners that are thinking about doing some testing on, those are all things that you kind of tread lightly on, obviously. And then capacity is a limit. So you need to look at the whole program and how many limits are you going to have up for all the possible trials going on around the world. So here are some potential underwriting concerns that we have when we're looking at some of these types of accounts. So if a high limit of insurance requirements relative to the number of subjects. So an example where I said in Sydney, Australia, you have to provide 20 million in limits and you only have 3 patients. That's a lot of limit to put up for a couple of patients. That's a concern. There are some contracts, as they used to be, as I said, in Belgium, that they're overly broad assumption of liability, so they basically cover everybody. You don't really want to cover everybody. The idea is the insurance should cover a patient if they get hurt during a trial. That's really what your intent is. You don't want to, as a sponsor, pick up liability of a hospital or doctor who did something negligent or wrong or intentional, because that's their professional liability, and why should you be responsible for that? That wouldn't be fair to the sponsor. Poorly drafted informed consent documents. I have rarely seen this. I mean, they have good attorneys and good advice and regulatory and people working together, that they're usually very well written documents. Unusual participant compensation, as I mentioned, unusual coverage or reporting period requirements. We need to look at frequency and severity of prior claims. Usually clinical trials, we're doing a lot of phase 1, so we haven't really had the product out there, so you don't see a lot of claims at that point. Once they get up to phase 3 and they're out to 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 patients, then once in a while you're going to see a claim that could occur. And then the vulnerable patients I mentioned. And that's it. So basically, that was kind of a broad overview. I know it was a lot of information to spit out at you, but if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to answer. But the clinical trial process is very interesting, and again, working ahead of time and putting it together and deciding what countries, where you're going to go, know your requirements, so that you're not coming, yelling, screaming at the 12th hour going, oh my gosh, I need a certificate in this country tomorrow, or I can't start. So.
Give us some examples, maybe some things that you've seen happen from like a claim standpoint, and how it got covered or how it didn't get covered?
Sure, I can give you a couple. One was actually in India, which was interesting. The claim was a person died, but she didn't have injury due to the drug. It had nothing to do with it. It was just kind of a fluke thing, totally different. But in India, one of the new regulations is if anyone dies or is injured during a clinical trial, their family is entitled to compensation. And it's not a large amount of compensation, but this poor person passed away, and their family was awarded $7,000. So that was something that was actually covered under the clinical trial because it was a product liability and it was a requirement of India. So it was a small claim, but if you think about that happening on a larger scale in India, you could see a lot of multiple claims happening like this. Now, in that case, they didn't have a local admitted policy in India because they didn't have a requirement. So the global master policy would respond, and it would have, but the deductible was $25,000. So the $7,000 was paid by the sponsor. So in that scheme of things, it was a covered claim, but it didn't get covered because of the deductible. We had another one where there was somebody in Germany who just had an adverse reaction to a drug, and they got very sick, and they were in the hospital for a very long time, and so they had a lot of ongoing medical, and that probably, I believe that loss was probably $25,000 to $50,000, thankfully, we're not seeing a lot of claims, a lot of frequency yet. But I think as more and more, as time goes on, you have more and more drugs and trials growing and growing and growing, and they're out there, you're gonna probably start seeing more litigation. As, you know, the more people that you're touching, the more possibility for products type of claim.
On that issue with India, so causation wasn't factored in, just, you know, they could have been injured by the truck as they walked across the street from the testing.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
I think that the thought process, from what I understand, of course, I've been to India, but they tell me that they're concerned with people, everybody just signing up into getting into trials, and they want to protect them. And in this case, they wanted some money to go to the family because of the loss of the person. Even if it was a grown person, it wasn't a little person, but still, it was the same concept. So yeah, it's, the no fault thing is a little bit tough.
So I find that people are frequently concerned about cost.
Yes.
You mentioned more claims down the road, so, you know, I understand that no one has a perfect crystal ball, but looking down, you know, Amy's perspective, 3 to 5 years, you know, where do you see the cost going for this product, for this service coverage?
Actually, it's gotten better. It's gotten more affordable. When trials were newer and younger, maybe 5 to 10 years ago, there were fewer players, and I don't think people understood what was going to happen or how trials were going to play out. And so it was very expensive. So to put in your Australia policy, for example, for $10 million, it costs $50,000 to $75,000. Whereas now that policy today, you can probably get it between $25,000 and $30,000. Now it does depend on the number of patients, but usually you're talking about a smaller 30 to 50 patient population in the early starts of trials. And there are more companies that have reduced their limits requirements. Australia is unusual, you know, France and Germany are unusual, but a lot of the companies now, like Colombia or Peru or Chile, they're only requiring $100,000 per patient. So to put that policy into place, maybe it's $3,500 or $4,500 because it's just a minimum policy. So I've actually seen the pricing get better. I think it's going to stay stable for a while. I really do, because there's enough capacity and there's enough expertise, and there's a lot of possibilities to write things that are going on out there. And a lot of the things that are being tested aren't extremely difficult. I mean, if you're talking implants and new implants coming down the road, they're probably the most difficult with a lot of litigation on products. But mostly everything else with all the cancer therapies and the different things out there, it's becoming more and more affordable. You're right, though. You have to watch the trends like anything else in insurance. You have a stable market, and hopefully it stays that way for a very long time to come. But if the litigation starts rising outside of the United States in these trials, or the requirements get stiffer, then I would say, yeah, that it would start going up.
So speaking of trends, have you noticed a change in the last 15 years between what you were insuring, let's say 5 years ago, versus what you're insuring today?
I'm seeing a lot of cancer therapies. That's probably one of the biggest things. We actually have seen, probably 5 years ago, there was a huge tick up in implants, spinal implants specifically. And now I've seen with a lot of the implant litigation going on, the implants have kind of dropped off. The drug therapies are increasing. So I'm hoping we're going to see more things on diabetes and Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, and I think they're starting to rise. So I would think those kinds of things are taking off. The medical device industry is kind of staying stable. You're seeing more 510K approvals, which means you don't have to go through the whole clinical trial process. So they're a little bit quicker. It's just an older, if you will, established industry. But based on some of the litigation, that might be changing too. So I say drug therapies.
Other questions?
You mentioned that the Chubb is the only one that's doing the overall, the umbrella coverage of this worldwide. And you know, just from personal experience, I mean, that's really gratifying that someone's doing that, because I've done it the other way, and it is really, I mean, I literally had policies in Leipzig and in Dresden, and I mean, individual policies in different provinces of Germany in order to be able to accomplish something, and had to work with individual brokers in Germany in order to get
Right,
that done.
and there are a few other characters, I'm the character, carriers out there that will do the global master, and they will try to help you using an affiliate, somebody that they're just affiliated with, not somebody that's one of their own employees, try to help them place the local coverage. But thankfully for Chubb, because we have so many offices around the world, we have Chubb people on the ground, and we have found you're right, we've found that it's easier to try to coordinate everything. Biomedic is a huge insurer, placement for local trials in Europe, and many people use them. They're great, they do a good job. But if they're doing, like you said, one of the locals, maybe they're doing Germany and France, and somebody else is doing the master, they're not always coordinated. And the problem with that, probably the biggest problem, is there could be gaps in coverage, or you could be paying more money because Biomedic's charging one thing and your other carrier's charging one thing, and they're not coordinating the two efforts, so they might be charging you more premium. Whereas if you have one company doing everything, they'll charge you so much here and so much here and kind of dovetail it.
All right, any other questions?
Just one more question. On the policy still, though, a local policy, even though Chubb's coordinating it? Or is it a Chubb policy from soup to nuts? In Australia, let's say, or Germany?
In Australia, in many countries, they are Chubb. They're written on Chubb paper. There are some countries that we are not there or we're not allowed to be there, so we do work with affiliates as well, but we have partner affiliates and they issue it on their paper on our behalf. It's still basically a Chubb product, if you will, and you come to Chubb if you had, loss control or claims needs. But there are some countries where you're not allowed to do business, or that we just